Hi, everybody. My name is John Britton. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Homebrew. Thank you for joining me here today. The first thing I wanted to say is thank you to everybody in the MacAdmins community for being so welcoming. I found MacAdmins, the Slack, maybe 6 or 8 months ago. I had never heard of it before. I joined up, started talking to people. Everybody's been super welcoming and helpful and giving me lots of advice. You know, we're building a company now that's meant to serve people in your shoes, and the feedback has been just amazing. You should feel very fortunate to work in an industry where you have such a strong community. So anyways, with that out of the way, today I'm going to be talking about Homebrew, the open source package manager, and balancing the needs of IT, security, and engineering teams at scale. The idea behind this is that Homebrew is a very useful tool. Lots of people use Brew every day, but it was never designed for use in kind of a fleet architecture where you're managing multiple different machines with some kind of overarching strategy. It's really built for the individual developer who manages their own machine and their own work. So today we'll talk about some of the challenges that poses and some solutions, some things that you can do to fix those problems. Also, a little bit about me. I'm a software engineer by training. I went to school in upstate New York at RPI, studied computer science there. Got my start in the industry doing software development, and then moved into developer relations, working with people on understanding how developer tools work and helping them be more productive through education. So it's really great to be here. Let's talk about the agenda. So first, I'm going to talk just a little bit about how companies use Homebrew, and then get into 3 kind of big challenges that people face. Provisioning, this is the deployment process. How do you get Brew onto the Mac? What do we do? Do we have a README file that we talk people through, have them do on their first day? How do we get it to interact with our centralized systems and deployment stuff? The second kind of big area is observability and management. So once Brew is out in production on your fleet of devices, what are the challenges related to knowing what's going on? What are the end users doing with Brew? What have they installed? What versions are there? Things like that. And then security enforcement and remediation. So I hear over and over and over again, every single time I talk to a MacAdmin about we need to set some policies, we need to have some kind of controls around this thing to make sure that we're not going off the rails. And we'll talk a bit about how you can do that, and also how you can be aware of vulnerabilities, what's gone wrong, when things are out of date, and how to fix those vulnerabilities. Lastly, we'll talk about Homebrew, the company that I started, and the tool for managing fleets of Macs with Brew on them. Just briefly, kind of the architecture and an overview, and then we'll have a section at the end for Q&A. And I'm really hopeful that the Q&A will be lively. So as I'm talking, please note down any questions that you have. Bring them up at the end. I'd love to get really in the weeds in the Q&A section. And then also throughout the conversation, there are a couple spots where I'll ask for some feedback from you all. Please don't be shy. Please give me your feedback. And if something is relevant, please bring it up. Put your hand up. I'll toss this thing out to you, and we'll go from there. So yeah, let's get started. First thing is Homebrew. What is Homebrew overall? Homebrew is a package manager. There's lots of different package managers out there. You've probably heard of apt or emerge, or there's even all kinds of different things. There's also package managers for languages. Things like Go have their, what do they call them? Cargo, right? Or Ruby has gems, and Python has, their eggs, I guess they call them. Whatever you want to call it. There's all different things. But in the world of package managers, I kind of see 2 really big categories. One is like a system-level package manager, and one is like a project-level package manager, or a dependency manager for your language or your environment. And Brew has traditionally been a system-level package manager. So it's on the same level as like apt in Ubuntu. You have Brew in Mac OS, right? You need to get things installed on your machine. There's no default place to go. My initial entrance to using Brew was I used to use Windows machines back many, many years ago before college. When I went to college, I went full in on Linux. I got a Gen 2 kind of base system and did everything. I compiled the kernel. I compiled everything from scratch. It took 2.5 days to install KDE. It was kind of rough, but I got used to the idea of there being a package manager. And when Apple came around and created Mac OS X with Unix underpinnings and everything that I'm used to from the command line, I was thrilled. I could get a new machine that was awesome hardware, worked really well out of the box, had all the Unix stuff, and I didn't have to think about drivers at all. So I immediately moved over to the Mac, and one of the first things I started to miss was having a package manager. I felt like when I got onto Gen 2, having a package manager, a way to just go and say, I want this application, make it so. And it would just magically appear on my machine working, was like a totally different way of operating. And it's, anybody who doesn't use these kind of things I don't know how they survive. So anyways, all this is a long-winded way to say, like, system package managers, like in an operating system, Mac OS for all of its history has not really had a package manager. There's no official way to do this. There have been other projects like ports, Mac ports, and Fink. There are probably other ones that I don't know about. I did use Mac ports for a number of years, and then I switched over to Homebrew. But anyway, so Homebrew is a package manager, system level. It's also a rolling release package manager. What that means is that every package in Brew is always kept up to date with the latest version from the vendor. So this is in contrast to some other package managers where you're able to select which version of the software you want to install, go back in time. Brew, always, the community always keeps it up to date with the latest and the greatest. There are a few select packages like Postgres or a couple others where there are multiple different packages for different versions, but in those cases, the upstream software vendor supports those versions fully as separate kind of products. So yeah, that's a little bit about Brew. And then I guess the last thing that I wanted to say about Homebrew is that it's open source. It's available. It's on GitHub. When Brew was created just over 15 years ago, we just had a meeting with the original creator, Max Howell, and we did like a live stream where we talked about 15 years of Homebrew. But anyways, when Brew was created, one of the really different things about it was doing it on GitHub. The entire project is in a Git repository, and every single package, the formula, the declaration of how to install that package is all open source. And that was probably one of the biggest drivers of Homebrew's success. The fact that anybody can show up to the project and make a contribution of a package, either improving an existing package, adding a new package, and it's very, very straightforward. Brew's written in Ruby, and Ruby's famous for DSLs. And the Brew formula, the things that they use for packages, the DSL is just very simple, very easy to use. So I'd encourage you, if you find a package that you can't, if you have something you want to install and there's no package, try to make it. There's great guides up on the Brew website, and on Homebrew on GitHub, there's all kinds of tutorials. And it's also one of the most welcoming open source projects I've ever seen. I've been a contributor to Homebrew for many years, mostly packages and upgrading packages. I've done a couple of things on the command line, but I've done a lot of other open source, and I think it's one of the best ones out there. They're very supportive, so I would definitely encourage you to go there. Okay, so let's talk about how companies are using Homebrew. There are kind of two categories of companies that I've been talking to a lot recently. One is we have engineers, and they use Brew. They already know it, and they're using it a lot. And then the other one is nobody at our company uses Brew, but we want to manage installing applications, and our other tools have a limited selection of applications that are prepackaged. And both of these are valid use cases for Brew, and I've talked to, especially in the education sector, I've met a lot of people here working in universities where they're using Brew as a way to default the machine setups for things. So from the perspective of the various involved parties, the engineers, they just want to use the tools they need to get their job done. Brew is a really easy way for them to do that. They can get all their dependencies. They're used to it. But from the security side, maybe it's not as pleasant because there's a lot of concern. Generally, when I talk to people who are security-minded about Brew, not really when we're talking about one device, but we're talking about tens, hundreds, or thousands, or even more devices, they're worried that there's something going on that they have no insight into. It's not. There's no way to know what's happening when your fleet is full of people with access to Brew. So they just really want to have visibility. They really want to be able to set some policies, make sure that things are under control, and they want to make sure everybody's up to date, whether it's for the latest and greatest features or for response to vulnerabilities. Some months ago, you probably saw the supply chain attack with XZ. That package, it was a very sophisticated attack, long-running attack where Effectively, someone infiltrated an open source project and created malicious code that was hidden away, and all of the package managers, including Homebrew, packaged it and delivered it to users. Fortunately for the Mac ecosystem, it was no impact. The Brew team really quickly fixed it after it was disclosed, and it was fine. But that's not always true everywhere. And so it's just an illustration of how vulnerable we can be and how not knowing and not having the ability to respond to those things can be challenging. So lastly, that brings us to the IT crowd, the folks, I would say here and the people I talk to the most about this, and they're kind of stuck in between. They always tell me, they say, I really want to serve my users well. I want the developers to be happy, right? I want them to have access to tools that they need. But they also say, we have these security requirements. I don't want to repackage every single application. There's definitely a trade-off that they have to make in this situation. So for them, we talk about how to ease deployment, how to make it possible to observe what's going on, and how do we manage things remotely. So let's dig in a little bit deeper to some of the problems. In the most common cases, it's software developers running macOS. They're running it on their desktop to do local development, or they're using it on CI, GitHub Actions or something similar. Other use cases we've seen is distribution of internal tools. So companies will have maybe a command line suite that helps them get their environment up and running. They package it with Brew. They create a new tap, which is a repository of additional packages, and then they use Brew to deliver that down to their end users. Also, we see a lot of examples of people doing distribution of a private project, an internal project, or something that they're turning into a product to external developers, because developers are using Brew already. It makes it really easy for them. For example, Orca, I know the Mac Stadium folks are here, but they distribute via GitHub, via Brew as well. And then lastly, setting up the automated installation. So whenever a new employee joins, we see this all the time in engineering. There's like a README doc. Here's a list of 27 steps you need to do. Install Brew, then install these packages, then download these repositories, do this. And we've seen a lot of cases where Mac admins like yourselves are scripting things and automating it with Brew, so they don't have to do all of that. So to do this with Brew, it's possible. You can have Brew and you can kind of manage it centrally. But the reality is that the strategies that the companies are employing are as follows. First one is do nothing. You can have Brew, it's allowed. We're going to give you admin access on your device. Go ahead and install it. Do whatever you want. We're going to look the other way. If it breaks, it's your problem. We're not going to help you. So it's basically unsupported. This is like totally the opposite strategy of what we're doing when we deploy an MDM in our organization. So I use this analogy of, the MDM comes in and you put it there to lock down the device and say, you can't do anything. And then you say, but you can have Brew, and it opens up this big back door, you can do whatever you want. And there's no way to know what's going on. So the reality is you can't easily take this away in an engineering context. It's pretty hard. So this is kind of the easiest, path of least resistance. Just do nothing and let them do it. So who's doing this now? Who just lets people use Brew? Don't be shy. No, the camera's not on you. So yeah, there's no one will know but me. Yeah, so this is definitely the most common. Huh? Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, we don't stop anyone. I wouldn't say we do nothing. Okay, yeah. We let them do what they like. So yeah, this is definitely the most common strategy for how to manage Homebrew in an organization, how companies can use Homebrew. The next strategy that I've seen is informed trust. So this is when you have a self-service system, you have some policies, but they're not really enforced, and yes, it's known, it might be part of your READMEs, it's supported. This is really documentation driven, and it depends on your users doing the right thing. And if people don't understand the underlying kind of stuff that's happening, how Brew works, it's really hard to manage. An example I have of this is I spoke to a company, and they're a very highly regulated company. They have 1,000 employees, engineers, and they all use Brew. They develop on Macs. They use local development as their environment standard. And they said to me, we have a list of allowed packages. If you want to install something with Brew, you need to go check this list and make sure it's on the list before you install it. There's no enforcement of this whatsoever. It's just a kind of trust situation. And it's a very big company with a very well-known name. I won't say who it is. But yeah, it's just like kind of mind-boggling that that's the security system. But it does work for them to an extent. So this is a second kind of strategy. Is anybody doing this? Saying these are the rules? Some in the back, a couple people, yeah, okay, great. And then the third strategy that is the most difficult, the least common, but also probably the most secure, convenient, like the best overall experience for people is to roll your own. I won't say the names on stage, but I can give you 5, companies that are publicly traded, that are very, very well known, that have their own internal forks of Brew, that they have an entire team set against them, managing them and doing all kinds of different work. So there's definitely a way to do some of this stuff yourself. So this is like having some management, having some observability, having support. You might make scripts to automate things, custom tools. I've heard a lot of people doing, using on GitHub, there's a gist that's very popular. I've seen it posted in the Mac admin Slack many, many times, which is like how to install Brew across your entire fleet with this script via your MDM. So there's people like customizing that stuff and doing it well. Big enterprises are doing very deep customization. Is there anybody who's building their own stuff for, so there's one over there. I won't say who that person works for. Yep, so yeah. When you're doing this, though, this is like you're building MDM scripts, you're building self-service policies, you have to build your own launch daemons, you have to do all your own kind of on-the-machine stuff. Now, this is the part where I would like a little bit of interaction from you. Is anybody doing anything else? Is there anything that you're doing that I didn't mention so far as a way to like manage and mitigate the risks and challenges with Brew? There's one more that I've heard. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So it's all just, the security team was like, yeah, we're going to let them do it. That's fine. But we want to know, it all has to be informed risk.
Yep.
So they know everything that's happening, and they can go back and say, no, get that off of there.
Yeah.
So their attitude was, let it happen, just monitor it really well.
Yep.
We've got extension attributes out the lot. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. The other not very great solution that I've heard is just don't allow Brew.
We tried that.
Yeah. It wasn't viable for you?
People were quitting.
Yeah, people were quitting. People were quitting because they took Brew away. Okay, I'm going to quote that later. So the story that I heard about taking away Brew, it's a very large bank. You probably would have heard of them. They said to me, hey, look, we had to take Brew away because we have ISO 27001 compliance requirements. Every single piece of software has to be verified before before it's allowed to be installed on the machines. And what they do is they basically run their MDM, and every single package that was in Brew that one of their developers would need, they would just repackage it themselves. And so they'd go into their MDM tool, and every single developer had to go in and self-service every package via their MDM tool, which is kind of a nightmare. So yeah, the reality is for most of us, it's not an option to take away Brew. So let's talk about some of the challenges related to deploying Brew and managing it, and some solutions that you can do on your own. So these are things that you can do with open source tools, writing some scripts yourself, or leaning on the community, things that people have done before. So Homebrew is made to be installed and managed by the end user. Deploying it to a fleet is a non-trivial operation. Many of you I know do this, but it's not without its faults. The prerequisites are as follows. You need to have a pre-existing user account with admin privileges. You need to have interactive access to the device, and you need to have a single user account per device. Maybe the single user account is not entirely true, but it's basically assumed that you're using a single user account on each device within the Brew kind of installation. So this is what it looks like. How many of you have seen this? Do this? Yeah, yeah. Just curl, curl this bash script. It's all good. This is perfectly adequate for end users, and really, it's just an ease of use thing. For end users, this is super easy. People are used to it, and that's why they do that. For us, as IT admins, we need to be able to do this via our MDM. So maybe some months ago, maybe it's close to a year at this point, Homebrew, the open source project, released a PKG installer. Homebrew, as an aside, Homebrew has a lot of features that people are unaware of. So probably like 30% of the time when I tell people there's a PKG installer for Homebrew, they're like, wait, what? I didn't know that. There's a bunch of other features like that. So yeah, there's a PKG installer. You can use it. And it has the exact same kind of installation side effects as the normal Brew installer does. But it can be installed via your MDM. However, it still has the same limitations. The user account has to exist on the device. You have to make sure that that's already created. So for example, if you were to take a device out of the box with Apple Business Manager and have it connect to your MDM without having the first user account created, this installer would not be able to run. It also has some dependencies on like Xcode tools and things like that, but essentially you can script this. You would just have to have it run after the user account has been created. This is all well and good. It gives you a way to deploy across the entire fleet in a consistent way, but it still doesn't give you any way to see what's happening on the device. Another thing that I hear over and over from people is, we don't want to just set up Brew, we want to set up a bunch of other stuff with it. So I want to share an open source project with you that was built while I was working at GitHub. This is a project called Strap. My co-founder, Mike McQuaid, who's also the project leader of Homebrew, while I was working at GitHub, we were both working at GitHub, he created Strap. The reason he created Strap was because we had built this huge amount of internal tooling at GitHub called Boxin. And Boxin was a Puppet-based kind of infrastructure as code tool for the fleet of Macs that the employees used at the company. And in theory, it was great. It had a lot of features. It was very, very robust. In practice, it was a huge pain for the end user to modify and configure it. So Mike wrote from scratch this thing called Strap with the goal of replacing that tool. So what it is, it's basically just a bash script. It's a really, really concise batch script. You can go check it out on GitHub. But what it does is it automates the installation of all of the things that you need to install the first time you set up a machine. And it has support for another one of Homebrew's lesser-known features called Brew Bundle. And I'll talk about Brew Bundle a little bit later. So I would highly recommend, if you're trying to automate setting up all these things in an open source way without a third-party tool, you should check out Strap. It's really, really useful. So again, for the interaction component, I talked a little bit about ways that we can deploy Brew. Is anybody doing anything differently? How are you getting Brew onto the devices? Are you leaving it up to your engineers to install or leaving it up to end users? What are you doing? Yeah, go ahead. You're making your own package? Okay, so they're making their own package and pushing it out via MDM. Any other strategies? Go ahead.
There was a random script last year that did it for you for as long as the user existed.
Is it on a gist?
I believe, yeah, but it did it for you. I didn't have to go and log in. I just pushed the script down and do it. It was a little funky sometimes.
Yep.
Usually worked.
Yeah. So I wish that this thing was more than just a gist. So what he mentioned was there's a script that he used that someone wrote. I don't know who wrote it. No, I wish it was like a proper repository on GitHub with a name so we could reference it more easily. Somebody might want to do that. But yeah, so those are all like common solutions. Okay, so moving on to observability and remote management of devices. For the most part, we have no visibility into what's going on inside of Brew. You might have a third-party tool like your MDM that gives you some context about what's going on, but generally, it's not very robust. So what we want to do here is we want to get insights into the tools that the company depends on and detect out-of-policy usage. Out-of-policy usage could be nefarious code or nefarious applications, like we don't want BitTorrent installed on any of our devices. Or it could be we want to make sure that a vulnerable version of a package is no longer installed, like the XZ vulnerability that we had before. We need to know which machines have the vulnerable package on it first in order to remediate the problem. And then once we find the problem, we want to be able to fix them. So OS Query Who here is using OS Query? Yeah, it's a couple people. So OS Query has a really cool module called Homebrew Packages. So if you use OS Query, you can use the Homebrew Packages module. What it does is it talks to the local Homebrew binary on the machine, gets the output from it, parses it, and then reports back all the packages and versions that are installed on the device. So if you're using OS Query, you could go about it this way. This will give you at least the observability aspect of like what's going on the device. But it won't let you update things. Another thing that I've seen in the kind of the roll your own strategy, especially at the big banks or the big organizations that have their own teams like dedicated to this stuff, is that they're scripting their own kind of metadata gathering tools. So Brew, as a command line tool, has lots of subcommands, lots of options. You can get all of this data out of it, but you have to script it yourself. So this is one way that you could do that. So we talked a little bit before about the idea of installing default packages. We also want to have a way to configure and upgrade Homebrew when there's new versions, keep things up to date, and support our users when they have trouble. One way to install default packages, or just install packages that maybe a project depends on or an environment depends on, is using a brew file. This is another one of those features that's kind of lesser known in Homebrew, but there's a project in the Homebrew organization on GitHub called Homebrew Bundle. And what it is it's a tool that lets you declaratively list out the dependencies or the things that your application or your environment requires that are from Brew. And then you run Brew Bundle, and Brew Bundle will go and make sure all of those things are installed. So if you have a default set of packages that you want to install, I hear over and over again people are doing policies in their MDM to push out certain packages. They're writing custom scripts and then sending those scripts over the wire via their MDM and running them, which have all kinds of issues with who does the script run as? Is it root or is it the local user? Which local user does it run? So all this stuff. Instead of all of that, instead of making all these custom scripts, you can write a file to disk called a brew file. That brew file can contain a list of packages that should be installed on the machine. And then all you need to do is make sure Brew Bundle is run once in a while. Right? Anytime that file changes, run Brew Bundle. Brew will make it so. Brew Bundle, the brew file can be global or per project. So if you have, for example, some engineers in your company and they have a bunch of different repositories they work on and they don't all work on everything, in each project you can put a brew file right in the project. And now instead of having them go through a set of dependencies and everything they need to install, they just run Brew Bundle once in the project and it'll update their machine. When I mentioned Strap earlier, there's a really cool integration that maybe is not quite applicable to the fleet, but I think to the folks in this room, this might be applicable to you for your personal machine. This is what I do. Strap has a feature that lets you install your dot files on your machine. So when you install Strap or when you use Strap for the first time, it will automatically go out to GitHub, fetch your dot files, bring them down on your machine, and configure your machine according to your dot files. If in your dot files you include a brew file, all of those things will be installed automatically. So I've gotten to the point with my setup where if I went and got a brand new Mac, I could run one command and it'd be up and running with every dependency, every configuration, everything on my machine, just like you would expect out of like a cloud kind of infrastructure as code setup. So this is a really useful project from that regard. We also talked about managing the configuration of Homebrew. So Homebrew has close to 100 configuration options. They all exist. If you go to brew.sh and look at the man page, the documentation, there's a list of all the different environment variables. And those environment variables let you do all kinds of different things. You can do things like set up artifact hosts. So instead of the endpoint going out to the public internet to download a binary package whenever they run brew install, it'll instead go to an artifact host that's hosted inside your VPN. Download it from there. So this is useful for cases where, obvious cases caching and making things faster, but also if you're in the hyper-sensitive security space and you want to be fully air-gapped from the internet, you can do this as well. I wouldn't say that it's a recommended necessary thing to do, but if you'd like to, it's there. We also added recently a few new configuration options. We upstreamed these changes to Homebrew, which are forbidden taps. So the ability to say, I don't want to allow the user to add new taps or new lists of repositories to Homebrew. so that there's like a little bit more control over what's happening on the machine. Forbidden formula and forbidden casks. Both of those are packages. Stop certain packages from being installed. In Homebrew speak, there's two types of packages. There's formula and there's casks. Formula are built from source. So the vendor of the product provides source code, then Brew compiles the source code and installs the binary on the device. And casks are where the vendor provides a binary. So Brew doesn't compile it, it just takes the binary right from the vendor. With all these environment variables, or all these configurations, you can configure them via the environment. So you go in and in your shell, set these environment variables. Up until a few months ago, we also upstreamed a change to Homebrew to add the ability to use configuration files. So now you can, via your MDM or otherwise, set a global configuration file that has any of these 100 different configuration options in it on the device, and then Brew will respect that. This doesn't have enforcement though. So if your end user has admin access on the device or otherwise has access to these configuration files or the environment, they'll be able to override and work around these things. So if you have a situation where you need to control the machine and prevent it from doing things, that won't work. But if it's more of a guidelines policy, we want to make sure people are going in the right direction, and anytime that there's a problem, they would stop, they would get some notification about it, this will work perfectly for you. When it comes to installing things remotely, remote management, if Brew is on the device, you would just think, hey, why don't I just run a command via my MDM? And the big challenge with that is that the way that Brew is installed, it's installed as owned by the individual user, and your MDM agent runs as root. And so when you write your scripts, that MDM agent will try to run as root, and Homebrew refuses to run as root for a bunch of various reasons. The idea is that they want to prevent you from doing something that you'll regret, basically. So if you do decide to manage this stuff via your MDM tool, the thing that you have to navigate is knowing which user to run as. So drop privileges and go to the user and then run it there. Besides the OS query and using MDM to upgrade things, are any of you doing any different solutions on how to remotely observe what's going on Brew within your fleet? Yeah, back here. Oh, Catchbox? Yeah. I mean, I'm gonna.
We wrote a bunch of salt grains and salt states that basically do what you were talking about doing, running
Excellent.
the commands and building, not a database, but a list of whatever's installed. And security is supposed to review those lists. They go into my dashboard, but they also have them going into their own dashboards. It's not perfect. It gets very big.
Yeah.
I think it was a nice solution in theory, but in practice, I think it's way more data than anybody can look at effectively,
Yeah.
especially as our environment continues to grow. Like when we put it in, we were at 1,000. Now we're at 2,800. We'll probably be at 4,000 next year.
Yeah.
It's going to get worse and worse and worse. So.
Excellent. Anybody else? Other things y'all are doing? No? So yeah, you can send that back up or hang on to it. It doesn't really matter. Yeah. Hey, it's fine. So yeah, the last kind of big challenge that we're talking about is security enforcement and remediation. So Homebrew has, like I mentioned before, like more security implications the more devices that you have. Right? The more data that's available, the more you don't know what's going on. You need a way to look at it more coherently. So it's not that it's less secure, it's just the surface area just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So when it comes to security enforcement and remediation, what we can do without, with what we have today is educate users on best practices. Make sure that they know how to choose, what they're installing, how to keep things up to date, make sure they know to run Brew Upgrade or run it for them. We talked a little bit about the informed trust, having a policy in place that people are supposed to follow. Make sure that you have a policy in place for reviewing these packages. Again, some of this relates to how strict are you on security review before something gets onto the endpoint. But the trend that I've been hearing from everybody over the course of this conference is they want to know in advance what's going on their machines. There's another thing that you can do, which is to install Homebrew with custom permissions. This is officially unsupported. So if you go to the Homebrew documentation, there's an alternative installations story that tells you how you can install Homebrew and how it can be owned by another user and things like that. But when you do that, you're kind of going into uncharted territory that you have to manage for yourself. And if something goes wrong and you bring like support tickets or whatnot to the open source project, they will probably not be able to help you. And another option on this front is limiting access with temporary privilege escalation. So one tool that I've seen used over and over again is SAP privileges. Is anybody using this? A few people? Okay. So one way that we've seen people do this is to, first of all, they have a goal. They say, we want to remove admin. Whether or not that's a valid goal is up for debate. I don't want to get into that. It's like, in the case that you say you want to remove, as a developer, I want admin access on my machine, right? But that's a different story. If there's a policy in place that says we need to reduce the amount of admin access on machines, then we have to find some kind of a solution for how we use Brew and how to manage it on the device without giving the user admin access. So what we've seen is giving the user the ability to escalate privileges with an audit history. So using something like SAP privileges, they're able to, on demand when they need to escalate, to install a package that requires root privileges. And within Brew, there are some packages that do require root access and some that don't. Generally, the division is if it's a PKG-based installer and that PKG does things on the system, because a PKG installer can pretty much do anything it wants anywhere on the system, without having the ability to escalate privileges or have admin privileges on your user, those will fail. So that's SAP privileges. Another thing that is very important is knowing about and remediating security vulnerabilities. So we need to stay informed about the vulnerabilities, create a response procedure, inform the end users or do for them the response procedure to mitigate this. And two of the ways that you can do this is with MDM to determine what was impacted and then fix it. But first, you need to know which packages are vulnerable. So I wanted to reference out to Repology. Repology is a directory of pretty much every package manager. It tells, it goes through every package manager, and for every package, it goes through all the packages and all the versions. And for each one of them, you can actually find a directory listing of all the known CVEs that are corresponding to that package. And so if you take this data and you cross-reference it, you'll be able to say, okay, within my fleet, there are these devices that have these vulnerabilities and make an action to fix them. It's a lot of custom work, but between OS query or some scripts that are pulling all that data, some scripts to pull this data off of another place, you can do this too. How are people responding to incidents? Do you, for example, let's use XZ that happened a few months ago. Something like that happens again. What do you do to update all your endpoints? How do you know which endpoints are impacted, and then what are you going to do to update them? No plan. I think that's actually an interesting situation. Okay, so well, in the next kind of topic that I wanted to go to is Workbrew and what we're building, and give a little bit of an overview of the architecture, and then get into some Q&A. So we're building Workbrew. Workbrew is a management tool for Brew. The delineation is very clear. Brew, the open source project, is a command line tool. It's open source. You run it on your machine. Workbrew is built on top of Brew with a way to manage Brew across your fleet. So it gives you a central console where you can see everything that's going on and then run commands, set configuration, and deploy to your fleet. The architecture of Workbrew is such that Homebrew, the open source project, is basically packaged and installed in a different way than it would be normally. The way that it's installed, we covered before, via either the curl script or the PKG file. It requires an existing user. It requires admin privileges. It requires interactive access. With Workbrew, we give you a PKG file. That PKG installs Brew on the device in an isolated user service account with separate privileges so that your end user does not have direct access to Brew. And it installs a kind of a wrapper that is also called Brew. Your end user can run the Brew command line just as normal, and it works just as they expect it to. And within that Brew wrapper, we're able to basically look at what's happening before they run the command and parse it and basically apply policies so that they're not able to go out of line. Additionally, from Workbrew, you're able to set all of those configuration policies, all those configuration variables on the devices and enforce that they can't be changed. And you can get kind of a high-level overview of what's going on within the fleet. So with that, I think I'm going to stop on Workbrew and just mention that tomorrow I'm doing a deep dive session about Workbrew. I'll go into how you would deploy it on your fleet, how you would do each individual kind of process, how you get on each machine, all of that stuff in full detail. And then now I would like to open it up for questions to go back and forth, hopefully in depth on any Brew-related issues or otherwise. And then I have this box I can throw to you. Anybody? No? All right. Well, if there's no questions, then I think we'll wrap it up. All right. Thank you.